Now, dear friends, we invite Dr. Taposhri Ganguly, Doctor of Statistical Science, Theosophical Society of England, London. She was born in India and she is a member of the Theosophical Society of London, doctor in statistics, educated at Stratford University, Glasgow. Physics topic, mathematical aggregation of probabilistic expert judgments. Currently, Dr. Taposhri Ganguly is working as a statistician for a consulting company in management in London and specializes in the construction of models of human behavior. Research article is based on the works of Helen Petrovna Blavatsky. So, the borders of consciousness. London, Mrs. Taposhri Ganguly, London, please, you are welcome.
Thank you so much. So, would I be sharing my slides or? Yeah, okay. Thank you. First of all, it's not Mrs. I'm still not married, so it's just Dr. Taposhri Ganguly. And thank you for the honor, and thank you for being so kind and letting me share this space. So what I'll be talking about today is bounds of consciousness. And first of all, just very briefly start with, what do I mean by bounds of consciousness? And is this something that it's even possible? These are the questions that kind of come up at the very beginning, because we've heard of consciousness for a very long time, but we don't really know what exactly bounds of consciousness are. So what led to my search was, I always felt, since I come from a statistical background, that there has to be some sort of boundary conditions around what we are measuring. So when we talk of consciousness, what exactly are the bounds? And my hunch is that it is pretty much a lower bound of zero at every level of consciousness that we look at. And it's not really a minus infinity to plus infinity game. It's pretty much a 0 to infinity game. That's what was my hunch. And then I started experimenting and looking through the study and looking through the literature around consciousness. And with that in mind, the answer that actually got me to putting these slides together is, are really there bounds of consciousness? And the answer is yes, there are bounds of consciousness, and the lower bound of consciousness is 0, mathematically speaking. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So if we start off looking at, from a theosophical perspective, the 7 principles of human consciousness, and this is something that everybody, I think, is very familiar with. I don't really need to get through it, but it's put out by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in the Key to Theosophy, and we know how she has defined this upper triangle and the lower self, which is sort of made up of this rectangle, if you like. So it consists of Atma, Buddhi, Manas in that particular order, and then the other bit that's made of like the physical body and the prana and the kama. And this is something everybody is familiar with when we talk of human consciousness within the theosophical literature. Now, I'm going to put a different spin to it, and I'm going to look at it from a Bayesian perspective. So if I really break this diagram down into 2 different aspects. So on the next slide, as you can see, that I have got the Bayesian belief network, which is broken down these 2 different diagrams into 2 different this diagram into 2 different contexts. So one, I call it the higher self, and one I'm calling it the lower self. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is like providing a Beliefnet perspective here. So in the Beliefnet perspective, on the left-hand side of the screen, you have the upper triangle, which is composed of the Atma, Buddhi, Manas. And on your right-hand side, you have the Sthula Sharira, the Linga Sharira, Prana, and Kama. That's the physical body, or the lower part of the diagram that we saw before on the previous slide. Now, each of these entities within a Bayesian context, and I'm not very sure how many are familiar with the Bayesian context, but within a Bayesian context, each of these entities are called nodes. And the arrows basically represent the direction of the flow. So the nodes that have arrows that are leading into them are the nodes like, for example, if we take the HS on the left-hand side, we have the nodes leading into them. They are called the derived nodes. And the nodes that do not have any arrows leading into them are the parent nodes. So derived in Helena Petrovna Blavatsky terms, she calls these derived nodes as vehicles. So if we go into the theosophical literature, what I call derived nodes statistically become vehicles according to her definition of these derivations. Now, what is interesting here, and then you have the antakarana, which is the connection between the higher self and the lower self. So that's the connection, and that is something that feeds both. So the arrow is pointing at both sides. So it is something that feeds both the sides of it. Can be either way. It's bidirectional, if you may like to call it that. So the idea is when you basically put the entire network of the seven of the human consciousness into this particular framework, what you get is a probabilistic view of consciousness. Now, with a probabilistic view of human consciousness, now it becomes very mathematical to basically find out if this actually has any kind of mathematical bounds. Now, what do I really mean by bounds or borders? It would be worth pointing out here that bounds or borders are pretty much like something that is limited or restricted by something. So you cannot go beyond that. You have to have that particular limit to it. So which is what it means by bounds. So what is the bound of consciousness? If that's the question that we are trying to answer, hence this entire perspective of it. So if we could move ahead on the next slide, please. So I'm just going to focus on one because it's very hard to go over each node. So I'm just going to focus on the LS node, or the lower level node, which was the rectangle that you had at the bottom of the diagram on the human consciousness bit from Key to Theosophy. So here, this node is like, so if we look at this Thula Sharira or the Linga Sharira, which are like the physical nodes. So now these nodes move through different conditions and states. Now, each condition brings a stream of knowledge, thus making each node represent an interactive form of the worlds. Now, here I'm going to bring in a scientist called Karl Popper, and I'm going to bring in his theory of the worlds, or the view of the worlds, which I'm going to elaborate in the next slide. So basically what I'm trying to say is that you have these physical body which are sort of flowing into, or which are giving information through into different other nodes like the prana and the kama, but they are not interacting within themselves. So there is a probabilistic flow of information, or a probabilistic flow, if you like, of information that goes within, the prana and the kama, which are then derived versions of the physical body, but not necessarily the bodies are interacting within themselves. Now, that could lead to an understanding of what exactly are these interactions that we talk about in the world, because as human beings we go through different conditions, we go through different states, and then how do we really play around consciousness when we are looking at these different states, and how do we define consciousness at different levels or at different states, and does every single state has a different sort of a limit to it? And this brings me to Karl Popper, because Popper has put out a theory. It's called the theory of three worlds. And in Popper's theory of three worlds, which is on the next slide, there is a deductivist or a reductionist approach to the understanding of these interactions between the worlds, which is going to help us understand how the consciousness or the bounds are going to be derived. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So here we are, we have Popper's three world and causation. Now, as I mentioned, that every single every single one of us, or every single human being, has to go through different conditions and different states. Now, Popper did put out this theory, and this is pretty much a causation, and it deals with the world interaction. So his theory of the three worlds were: world one, which was pretty much the objects and the states and systems; world two was individual states of consciousness, perceptions, knowledge, emotions; and world three is a platonic world of ideas, world that exists nowhere, but which does have an existence and which does interact with human minds. So what we really have seen is, from the slides before and the one previously, that the flow that we talk about, which goes on to the flow of information from the nodes into the derived nodes, is the flow of consciousness. And these flow pretty much have a probabilistic view of them, because they keep changing given the states, given the conditions, given the various forms that one is in. And also the very important, it would be imperative to say here, like I did touch upon it briefly before, that there is a reductionist approach to understanding what happens. So it's pretty much, we are building things up. So it's a reductionist approach. And that is also important, because if we don't go through that approach of causation, it will be very hard to find the bounds of consciousness that we are aiming to find, or that I'm aiming to find or put together through these few slides that I have it here. Now, in Popper's view, it is a downward causation which is most important, and it sits guiding the interaction among the three worlds as he had proposed. So as I've also touched upon it, the downward causation, if you look at very deep within the theosophical literature, it's one of the principles that is used to explain or understand consciousness. In plain terms, it is also the causal relationship. Now, there is always a cause and effect, and these causal relationships are better explained, I think, in my limited understanding, if you have a reductionist or a downward causation view, as opposed to that of like, having a sort of an upward exploratory or extrapolation view on the approaches that you would set to basically determine the bounds of consciousness or the different states of consciousness. Hence this particular approach of downward causation. So here is something that I came across, which I thought was very interesting. And this is a quote by Pascal, and I'm going to read it out. He said, "When I consider the short extent of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces unknown to me, and which know me or not, I am terrified and astonished to find myself here and there. For there is no reason why it should be here, not there. Why now rather than at any other time? Who put me here? By whose order? Am I here?" And so on and so forth. And this was translated by J.M. Cohen in 1961, and this appears in the book called The Self and Its Mind by Karl Popper. And this is where this quote leads you to understand and to basically see, like, what exactly is determining this entire flow or chain of things. What you define consciousness in this particular space might not be true, or might not be really held true or constant, or even can be explained in another space and time. So this is pretty much a concept of interaction, and causation definitely cannot happen without interaction. So we saw that causation, and when we started off with the Bayesian belief network, we definitely have these causal links, and then these causal links are definitely form of the interactions that happen across people, across different states, not only across the worlds, but also at a very granular level across different states of being. So if we come to interaction, and I have already explained that, but I'm just going to briefly go over it. It's pretty much worth mentioning that the brain is sort of most scientific literature have tapped into the brain as the seat of consciousness, but it's not really the brain. It's pretty much the behavior that's the seat sits at the seat of consciousness. And if you look at along the lines of mind and body, it paves way for self-consciousness theories, which are a little different from when we talk about when we talk about consciousness as a whole. So according to Popper, full consciousness depends on having an abstract theory, which is linguistically formulated. So when we do not have a language to explain it, it gets really difficult to put it forward. Also, it's worth mentioning here that the brain can be thought of as a library, which can be tapped into for information and build up the awareness or consciousness when it comes to from the lower levels. Hence, the language will play a very, very crucial point up until here, but not beyond this. A, we do not have a language, and B, it will be very hard to explain it, even if we did have a language. And which is why it's a self-conscious theory where we are literally, which we are able to explain, but not beyond that. So if we come on to determining the bounds, now both Popper and Blavatsky, among other scientists and philosophers, did mention that human consciousness is not a single faculty, but it's an interactive mechanism within humans. Now, whether the interaction is based on Popper's 3 worlds and or whether it's an interaction based on environments and genes, the interactions are prerequisites in determining consciousness. As we are familiar with the notion of probability, that for any event, it's always progressing in time and space. Even if the space is infinite, the probability is always going to be positive. So with that said, I think it would be very safe to sort of come in within to a conclusion that within the framework of events that we have, the probabilistic bounds of any event, or the lower bound of consciousness, as I would like to call it, is set to 0. Also within the scientific community that treats consciousness as a scientific dualism based on matter and energy, the lower limits of the sequences are 0. Now, this might not be very true held together when you look at the scientific literature, which negates mind and just talks about matter and energy. But even with those frameworks, the scientific notion, or when you come to talking about the lower bounds, it's always set to 0. It never moves beyond it moves to infinity, but it never goes beyond 0. Hence, it's worth pointing out that the lower bound of consciousness is 0 from whatever little bits and pieces that I've put together. So with that, I think I would like to thank everyone for listening in and for your precious time. And here are a few of the books and references that I used for this particular presentation. Thank you.
Дорогая Taposhri, огромное спасибо.
Dear Mrs. Taposhri, thank you very much for your report. Please, please stay with us 1 minute more, because if we have any questions, we'd like to ask about them. I have one question.
У вас есть 3 принципа.
You have 3 principles. Atma Buddhi Manas. And Atma is the parent node or principle. And you have 4 lower principles. You have, and here you have as a parent nodes 2 principles. But they don't influence each other. I think that it is contradiction, contrast to the common point of view. I'd like you to speak about it, please.
Thank you for the question. Within the Bayesian framework, the way I put it, it's pretty much like where you have the interaction is not really an interaction in the worldly terms of it. It could be an interaction in another plane, but not in the plane of Karl Popper. Karl Popper's world of the 3 worlds are pretty much, like he said, world 3 is in the Platonic framework of events. So the interaction very much is possible in a higher dimension, but in the lower dimension that we are mentioning it, or even if you look at a single line interaction, that interaction is not possible, which is the mathematical way of determining the bounds. Otherwise, it would be very difficult if we have to account for the higher level interactions going ahead. So once we know the bounds are coming to zero, the lower bounds are coming to zero, we can then map it onto a higher dimension because we are very familiar with it. But on a lower dimension, that interaction is pretty much it's absent within the Bayesian framework. That's the way I put it. Does that answer?
Thank you. Dear Ms. Taposhri, I think the answer is, thank you for the answer. And I want to add a little. When we speak that Atma has the ability and can come to the lower levels, Helen Petrovna says that she doesn't go anywhere, but it stays on her level. But it only penetrates everything, and on the sixth principle, the interconnection of different levels of consciousness appears. So thank you. It's a little addition to your answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So one more person, Nadezhda Bikalova, please. I would like to ask you, according to Karl Marx, he said, in your report, you spoke about the low border of consciousness and how I asked you. So the phrase is that being is determined by consciousness. Could you please speak on this expression in your terms of the borders of consciousness? That is the question.
Could you repeat the question, please? You said being.
The question is, could you speak about this expression that being determines the consciousness?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. So being is you. So let's look at being in terms of in a very mathematical setting of being. So you are, and there is this thing that is there. So in your being and then becoming and then, you know, and so on and so forth, that's a journey that you take on. And that is also a journey that starts from a 0-1, that mathematically it's also a journey that's going to be on a 0-1 line. Now, whether it wherever it starts, whether it starts at a 0 or whether it starts at a 1, it's a sum total that you would take up on an minus infinity to plus infinity big mathematical line, if you like to visualize it like that. And it is these little parts that are going to add up to make that complete line or your complete framework of so-called existence or being. And these little bounds that we have are bounds which are basically within this little framework, the little transitions that we make, that we sort of understand as life or human life, from a particular time stamp and different states and different conditions. And that is what's going to add up. So what bounds are, what bounds do, bounds basically are related to within that particular time frame that you are in right now. And that could be within a 0-1 line, but the entire line is the entire real line, if you like to think of it. It goes from minus infinity to plus infinity. Does that explain, does that answer the question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, thank you for these comments.
Mrs. Taposhri, that your report is very interesting.
And we thank
It's
Taposhri
so
for
interesting that it caused
this
different
report. We
questions.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We go along further.
We are now going further.